General Sarah Chen stood at the front of Advanced Military History, staring at 32 teenage faces that showed about as much interest as a dead fish. Behind her, holographic displays showed the Battle of Kepler Station, where she'd led 3,000 soldiers against impossible odds, where she'd saved humanity from the Vorthak invasion, where she'd become the youngest general in human history. The key tactical decision, she began, her voice carrying the same authority that had commanded respect across 3 star systems, was the flanking maneuver through asteroid field 7 Alpha. A boy in the 3rd row raised his hand. General Chen, why didn't you just use the quantum torpedoes from the start? Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd explained this twice already. In war, soldiers hung on her every word. Here in Roosevelt Military Academy, she might as well be speaking to the void. Because Cadet Morrison quantum torpedoes have a limited range in asteroid fields, the gravitational interference, But in the sim games, they work fine, Morrison interrupted. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. 6 months ago, she'd been planning strategies that saved entire worlds. Now she couldn't get through a simple lesson about basic military tactics without interruption. Sim games, she said slowly, are not reality. The class erupted in whispers and snickers. Sarah had faced down alien war machines the size of skyscrapers without flinching, but somehow these kids made her palms sweat. She turned back to the hologram, trying to regain control. The Vorthak had superior firepower and numbers. Victory required, Did you really kill a Vorthak with just a plasma knife? This from a girl named Kim Santos, whose eyes actually showed some interest. For a moment, Sarah's mind flashed back to the corridors of the enemy ship. The 20-foot-tall alien warrior with 4 arms and armor that could deflect military-grade lasers. The desperate close-quarters combat when her rifle ran dry. The impossible angle she'd found to slip the superheated blade between armor plates. Yes, she said simply. How? Kim pressed. They're like 3 times our size. Sarah found herself actually smiling for the first time that day. Because humans don't fight fair. We fight smart. For the next 10 minutes, she had their attention. She told them about human adaptability, about how Earth's brutal evolution had created the only species in known space that excelled at improvisation. How while other races built perfect strategies for perfect conditions, humans specialized in making terrible situations work anyway. But then the bell rang, and the moment shattered. Students packed up their tablets and filed out, already chattering about lunch and gossip and everything except the lesson that had cost her friends their lives to learn. Sarah slumped into her desk chair as the classroom emptied. Through the window, she could see the academy's training grounds where other instructors ran their students through combat drills. Everything looked so orderly, so controlled, nothing like real war. Her tablet chimed with a message from Principal Rodriguez. Faculty meeting at 1500. Please review the new classroom management protocols. Classroom management protocols. Sarah Chen, who had managed a multi-species coalition fleet, needed protocols to handle teenagers. She pulled up her lesson plans for tomorrow. Pre-war diplomacy and the failure of the Geneva Accords. Another topic where her students would struggle to understand that real decisions had real consequences. That the politicians who'd failed to prevent the Vorthak War weren't evil or stupid, just human. Just like her. The truth was, Sarah had volunteered for this assignment. After 3 years of constant combat, she'd thought teaching would be a break, a chance to shape the next generation of military leaders, to pass on hard-won knowledge that might save lives. She hadn't counted on the next generation being more interested in their social feeds than in staying alive. Her office door slid open, and Kim Santos stuck her head inside. General, I was wondering, could you tell us more stories tomorrow? About the war, I mean. The real stuff, not just the tactics. Sarah looked up, surprised. You want to hear about the war? Well, yeah. I mean, you were there. You lived it. That's way cooler than reading about it in textbooks. After Kim left, Sarah sat alone with her thoughts. Maybe the problem wasn't the students. Maybe she'd been approaching this all wrong. These kids didn't need another lecturer reciting doctrine from dusty manuals. They needed someone who could show them what humanity was really capable of when pushed to the edge. They needed stories, real ones, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they had no other choice. Sarah Chen had plenty of those stories. Tomorrow, she decided she'd try a different approach. She'd teach them what it really meant to be human in a universe that seemed designed to kill them. She just hoped she could figure out how to do it, without losing her mind first. Sarah arrived early the next morning, her uniform crisp despite the sleepless night she'd spent planning. Instead of starting with her prepared lecture, she dimmed the lights and activated a different hologram. Not a tactical display this time, but a recording from her personal files. The image showed a cramped ship corridor, emergency lighting casting red shadows on the walls. The camera shook as explosions rocked the vessel. "This is the TSS Valiant," Sarah said quietly. 3 days into the siege of Proxima, we'd been trapped in the outer system for 72 hours with no supplies and minimal life support. The students, who'd been chattering when they entered, fell silent. The hologram showed soldiers moving through the corridor, their faces gaunt and determined. The Vorthak had cut off all escape routes. Standard military doctrine said we should surrender to preserve lives. But there was a civilian transport with 8,000 colonists trapped in the planet's atmosphere. If we surrendered, they died. Morrison, the boy who'd interrupted yesterday, leaned forward. "So what did you do?" "We did what humans do best," Sarah said. "We improvised." She walked through the recording, explaining how her exhausted crew had jury-rigged mining explosives into torpedo warheads, how they'd used the ship's waste heat to mask their approach, how a cook named Martinez had suggested using the galley's microwave emitters to jam Vorthak communications. "The alien commanders couldn't understand our tactics because they made no sense," Sarah continued. "Vorthak military doctrine is based on mathematical precision. They plan for every variable, calculate every risk. But humans? We excel at turning variables into advantages." Kim Santos raised her hand. "But how did you know it would work?" "We didn't." Sarah's admission hung in the air. "That's the point. Human military history is full of impossible victories won by people who had no business winning. We don't succeed because we're stronger or smarter than other species. We succeed because we're willing to try things that shouldn't work." She brought up a new display showing statistics from the war. Human forces had been outnumbered 5-1, outgunned 10-1, and had inferior technology across the board. Yet humanity had won 60% of major engagements. "The Galactic Military Academy studies our tactics now," Sarah said. "Not because they're elegant or efficient, but because they're unpredictable. They call it the Terran paradox. How does a species with average intelligence and inferior technology consistently defeat superior enemies?" A quiet student named David Park spoke up. "Because we're crazy?" Sarah grinned. "Because we're adaptable. Earth is the only known world where evolution favored improvisation over specialization. Every other species we've encountered developed in stable environments. Their evolution rewarded predictable responses to predictable challenges." She pulled up images of Earth. Hurricanes, earthquakes, ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts. Our planet tried to kill us every few thousand years. The species that survived weren't the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who could completely change their behavior when the rules changed. That's why humans are the only known species that actively seeks out stressful situations for entertainment. Morrison looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Extreme sports, horror movies, competitive games, putting hot sauce on food that's already burning your mouth." The class laughed. "Other species avoid stress because their evolution taught them that stress equals danger. Human evolution taught us that stress equals opportunity." The room was completely quiet now, everyone listening. "That's what happened at Proxima," Sarah continued. "When the Vorthak trapped us, their instinct was to calculate the most efficient solution within existing parameters. Our instinct was to throw out the parameters and create new ones." She showed them the aftermath, the successful rescue of the civilian transport, the captured Vorthak command ship that provided intelligence crucial to winning the war, the promotion that made her the youngest general in human history. "But here's what the history books don't tell you," Sarah said, her voice growing serious. "I was 23 years old. I'd been in space for exactly 4 months. I had no business commanding anything more complicated than a lunch order." The students stared at her. "So why did it work?" "Because the experienced officers were thinking like soldiers. I was thinking like a human. I wasn't trying to fight a war. I was trying to solve a puzzle. And humans love puzzles, especially ones that seem impossible." She brought up a new image, a classroom full of alien cadets, all identical in their perfect posture and attentive expressions. "This is the Altarian Naval Academy. Their students never interrupt lectures, they never question authority. They graduate with perfect scores and become competent, predictable officers. Sarah looked around her classroom. They also lose every engagement against human forces. Morrison raised his hand again, but this time he looked thoughtful rather than challenging. So, when I interrupted you yesterday, you were being human, Sarah finished. Questioning assumptions, looking for better solutions, refusing to accept information just because an authority figure presented it. She paused. In a human military unit, that makes you valuable. In my classroom yesterday, it made me panic because I was trying to teach like an Altarian instead of like a human. Kim Santos grinned. So we're supposed to be disruptive? You're supposed to think, Sarah replied. To question, to look for solutions that haven't been tried before. That's what makes us human, that's what wins wars. The bell rang, but for the first time since Sarah had started teaching, no one immediately packed up to leave. General, David, Park said quietly, could you tell us about some of the other battles? The ones where being human made the difference? Sarah smiled. Tomorrow we'll talk about the defense of Luna Base. 47 humans holding off a Vorthak siege for 3 weeks using nothing but mining equipment and sheer bloody-mindedness. As the students filed out, chattering excitedly about the lesson, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Maybe she could do this after all. Maybe teaching wasn't about imposing discipline and demanding respect. Maybe it was about helping these kids understand that being human was its own kind of superpower. Word about Sarah's new teaching style spread quickly through Roosevelt Military Academy. Her next class was packed, with students from other sections crowding in the back and sitting on the floor. Even some instructors had found excuses to linger in the hallway. Sarah stood before a holographic recreation of Luna Base, a mining facility, on the far side of Earth's moon that had been converted into humanity's last defensive position. The structure looked pitifully small against the backdrop of space. 47 people, she began. That's all who remained when the Vorthak siege began. No military training except basic emergency protocols. Their commander was Elena Vasquez, a geological engineer who'd been on the moon for 3 years studying mineral deposits. She activated the recording, showing the approaching Vorthak fleet. Massive ships that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built, their dark hulls bristling with weapons designed to crack planets. Standard military doctrine would have called for immediate evacuation, Sarah continued. Luna Base had no strategic value worth defending, and 47 civilians couldn't possibly hold off a Vorthak assault force. Morrison raised his hand. So why didn't they evacuate? Because they couldn't, Sarah replied. The Vorthak had already destroyed the transport ships. And because Elena Vasquez was thinking like a human. She brought up Vasquez's personnel file. Born in Mexico City, degrees in geology and mining engineering, 3 children back on Earth, no military experience beyond mandatory citizen training. When the Vorthak demanded surrender, Vasquez told them to go mine an asteroid. Then she did something extraordinary. She turned a mining facility into the most effective fortress in human history. The hologram shifted to show the base's interior. Corridors barely wide enough for 2 people. Chambers carved directly from lunar rock, equipment designed for moving tons of ore. Humans are natural tunnel fighters, Sarah explained. We evolved in caves, hunting prey through confined spaces. The Vorthak evolved on open plains under 3 suns. They're claustrophobic in enclosed areas, and their tactics depend on overwhelming firepower in open engagements. Kim Santos was taking notes furiously. So the base design worked against them? Accidentally, yes. But that was just the beginning. Vasquez realized something else. Luna Base wasn't a military installation. It was a giant mining machine. And mining machines are designed to move rock, extract materials, and process raw ore into useful products. Sarah walked them through Vasquez's innovations. How she'd reprogrammed mining drones to carry improvised explosives. How she'd turned ore processors into ammunition factories. How she'd used the base's main excavator to bury the primary landing area under tons of lunar regolith. The Vorthak tried to assault the base 17 times, Sarah said. Each time they expected to fight soldiers. Instead, They found themselves fighting an entire environment that had been weaponized by people who understood every bolt and wire in the place. She showed them recordings from the siege, Vorthak warriors stumbling through corridors filled with mining equipment that had been booby-trapped by people who built it. Explosive charges detonating in precisely calculated sequences to bring down specific sections of tunnel. The massive industrial fabricators working around the clock to produce ammunition from raw lunar ore. By the end of the first week, the Vorthak commander was requesting reinforcements. Not because he was facing superior numbers or technology, but because he couldn't predict what the humans would do next. David Park looked up from his notes. What was the weirdest thing they tried? Sarah grinned. Day 12. The Vorthak had established a forward position in the main excavation chamber. Standard assault tactics couldn't dislodge them, so Vasquez tried something different. She used the base's atmospheric processors to fill the chamber with aerosolized lunar dust, then ignited it with a mining laser. The class stared at her. She turned the air itself into an explosive. Sarah continued. The Vorthak had never encountered anything like it because dust explosions require specific atmospheric conditions that only exist on worlds with particular types of industrial processes. It's not a military tactic. It's an industrial accident that Vasquez deliberately caused. A new student who'd squeezed in from another section raised her hand. Did it work? It cleared the chamber in 30 seconds and convinced the Vorthak that humans were fundamentally insane. Sarah paused for effect, which, from their perspective, we probably are. She brought up comparative psychological profiles, human stress responses versus Vorthak behavioral patterns. The differences were striking. When faced with an impossible situation, Vorthak psychology drives them to find the most logical, efficient solution within established parameters. Human psychology drives us to ask, what if we tried something completely different? The room was silent except for the scratch of styluses on tablets. That's why Vasquez succeeded where trained soldiers might have failed. She wasn't thinking about military tactics or defensive strategies. She was thinking about problems and solutions. How do you stop someone from entering your base? You make the entrance dangerous. How do you fight enemies with superior weapons? You fight them somewhere their weapons don't work. How do you hold a position with limited resources? You turn everything around you into a resource. Sarah activated a new display showing casualty reports from the siege. 47 humans had held off over 3,000 Vorthak troops for 3 weeks, inflicting casualties at a ratio of nearly 50-1. When relief forces finally arrived, they found Luna Base transformed into something that looked like a work of abstract art, designed by someone having a particularly violent nightmare. Vasquez had turned every piece of equipment into either a weapon, a trap, or a shield. Morrison was shaking his head in amazement. And she had no military training? None. But she had 3 years of experience solving problems in an environment where mistakes could kill you. She understood that humans don't survive by being stronger or smarter than our enemies. We survive by being more adaptable. Sarah looked around the crowded classroom, seeing engaged faces and active minds. Every one of you has something that no other species in the galaxy possesses: the ability to look at an impossible situation and ask, what if? You're descendants of people who survived ice ages by making clothes from mammoth hair, who crossed oceans in wooden boats, who figured out how to fly by watching birds. She gestured to the hologram of Luna Base. Elena Vasquez didn't save 47 people because she was a military genius. She saved them because she was human. Because when faced with an impossible situation, she did what humans do. She got creative. The bell rang, but this time no one moved to leave. General, Kim Santos said, what happened to Elena Vasquez after the siege? Sarah smiled. She was offered a commission as a military engineer. She turned it down and went back to mining. Said she preferred working with rocks to working with warriors. She paused. Though she did design the defensive systems for 12 other frontier bases, none of them were ever successfully attacked. As students finally began filing out, chattering excitedly about the lesson, Sarah noticed Principal Rodriguez standing in the doorway. The older man was smiling. Interesting teaching methods, General Chen, he said as the room cleared. Is that a problem, sir? Not at all. Test scores in your class have improved 30% in the last week. More importantly, I've got cadets from other programs requesting transfers into military history. Rodriguez paused. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. After he left, Sarah stood alone in her classroom, looking at the holographic display of Luna Base. Maybe she was finally figuring this out. Maybe teaching wasn't about imposing order or demanding respect. Maybe it was about showing young humans just how extraordinary they could be when necessity demanded it. 3 weeks into Sarah's transformation as a teacher, the first real challenge arrived in the form of Cadet Marcus Webb. He slouched into class 15 minutes late, his uniform rumpled and his attitude radiating boredom. "Sorry, I'm late," he announced to the room without looking at Sarah. Traffic was murder. There was no traffic between dormitories and classrooms. Sarah recognized the type immediately, the student testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before consequences arrived. "Take a seat, Cadet Webb," she said calmly. "We're discussing the breakthrough at Titan Station." Webb dropped into a chair and immediately pulled out his personal tablet, making no effort to hide the game he was playing. Several other students glanced nervously between him and Sarah. In the old days, Sarah would have crushed this behavior immediately. A sharp word, a disciplinary report, an assertion of authority that brooked no argument. But she'd learned something important over the past weeks. Authority imposed was fragile, while authority earned lasted, so she continued her lesson, letting Webb play his game while she talked about Captain James Okafor and his impossible mission to break through Vorthak lines around Saturn's largest moon. The enemy had established a blockade with overlapping fields of fire, Sarah explained, showing tactical displays that even Webb occasionally glanced at. Standard doctrine called for a siege lasting months. But Okafor had a problem. The research station on Titan was developing a weapon that could end the war, and they only had days before the Vorthak discovered it. Kim Santos raised her hand. "So how did one ship break through a blockade designed to stop entire fleets?" "By thinking like a human instead of like a military strategist," Sarah replied. Okafor realized that Vorthak defensive patterns were based on mathematical models of optimal ship placement. They'd positioned their vessels to create the most efficient killing field possible. She highlighted the enemy formation. A perfect sphere of overlapping weapon ranges with no gaps, larger than a shuttlecraft. But Okafor was a former asteroid miner before he joined the military. He understood something about space that most naval officers didn't. It's three-dimensional, and three-dimensional problems sometimes have four-dimensional solutions. Morrison looked puzzled. "What's a four-dimensional solution?" "Time," Sarah said simply. Okafor didn't try to find a gap in the blockade. He created one by attacking when the Vorthak were in transition between defensive positions. Webb snorted without looking up from his game. "Sounds like a lucky guess to me." The classroom fell silent. Sarah felt every eye turned toward her, waiting to see how she'd respond to the direct challenge. "You think it was luck, Cadet Webb?" "I think these stories are mostly propaganda," Webb said, finally looking up. "Heroes doing impossible things because they're so special and human. Reality isn't like that." Sarah studied the young man's face. Behind the attitude, she saw something familiar. Pain. Loss. The look of someone who'd stopped believing in heroes because heroes had failed him. "You're right," she said quietly. Webb blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. "Reality isn't like the stories," Sarah continued. "It's messier, more complicated. People make mistakes. Good plans fail. Heroes die." She paused. "Would you like to hear what really happened at Titan Station?" Webb's tablet went dark. For the first time since entering the room, he was paying attention. Sarah brought up a new display: medical records, casualty reports, after-action testimonies that had been classified for years. "Captain Okafor's brilliant plan killed 18 people," she said bluntly. "His ship was damaged so badly that half the crew died from radiation exposure during the breakthrough. The research station was evacuated, but the weapon they'd been developing was destroyed in the process." The classroom was dead silent. The official reports call it a strategic victory. Okafor received the Congressional Medal of Honor. The history books praise his innovative tactics. Sarah's voice grew heavy. "But the captain I knew spent the rest of his life wondering if there had been a better way." She pulled up a personal recording. Okafor in a hospital bed, his hair gone from radiation treatment, talking to a military interviewer. In the recording, he says the hardest part wasn't breaking through the blockade. It was writing letters to 18 families explaining why their children died for a weapon that didn't even exist by the time they reached it. Webb was staring at the display. His attitude completely changed. "So why do we study these battles?" Sarah asked the class. "If the heroes were flawed and the victories came at such terrible cost, what's the point?" David Park spoke up hesitantly. "Because they tried anyway." "Because they were human," Sarah corrected gently. Okafor didn't succeed because he was perfect. He succeeded because when faced with an impossible choice, he chose to act rather than surrender. That's what humans do. We try, we fail, we try again. We make mistakes and learn from them. We pay terrible prices for necessary victories. She turned to Webb directly. "You said these stories are propaganda. You're not wrong. But they're not propaganda about human perfection. They're propaganda about human persistence." Webb's voice was barely audible. "My dad was on the Titan mission." The pieces clicked together for Sarah. Webb wasn't just being disruptive. He was protecting himself from stories that made his father's death sound glorious instead of tragic. "What was his name?" she asked. "Lieutenant David Webb, communications officer." His hands were clenched on his desk. He died 3 days after the breakthrough. Radiation poisoning. Sarah sat on the edge of her desk, abandoning formal classroom protocol. "Then you know something the rest of us don't. You know that heroism isn't about being invincible. It's about being afraid and acting anyway." She brought up the crew roster from Okafor's ship. "Your father kept communications open during the entire breakthrough. Every other system on the ship was failing, but the comm array never went down. That's why the evacuation of Titan Station was so efficient. That's why they saved as many people as they did." Webb was staring at his father's name on the display. "The weapon they were developing was a failure," Sarah continued, "but the research data was transmitted to Earth before the station was destroyed. 3 years later, that data led to the development of quantum shielding technology that saved millions of lives." She stood and addressed the entire class. "This is what it means to be human in a hostile universe. We don't win because we're stronger or smarter than our enemies. We win because we're willing to sacrifice for things we'll never see. We fight today so our children have a tomorrow, even if we're not there to share it with them." Webb wiped his eyes quickly, probably hoping no one noticed. "Your father wasn't propaganda, Cadet Webb. He was a human being who did his job under impossible circumstances because other people were counting on him. That's not a perfect hero from a story. That's something better. That's real." The bell rang, but nobody moved. The weight of the lesson hung in the air like smoke. Finally, Webb stood up. "General Chen? Could I stay after class? I'd like to hear more about the mission. The real stuff. Not the official reports," Sarah nodded. "I'd be honored to tell you about your father, Cadet Webb. He was a good man." As the other students filed out quietly, Sarah realized she'd learned something important about teaching. Sometimes the most disruptive student wasn't trying to challenge authority. Sometimes they were trying to understand how they fit into a story that seemed too big and too painful to be real. Sometimes they just needed someone to remind them that being human was enough. Sarah's classroom had become the unofficial gathering place for cadets from across Roosevelt Military Academy. Her afternoon sessions now drew students from engineering, logistics, even the medical corps. What had started as advanced military history had evolved into something the cadets called human studies. Principal Rodriguez had stopped by again, this time with a concerned expression. "General Chen, I've been getting complaints from other instructors. Their classes are half empty because students are congregating in yours." Sarah looked up from her lesson plans. "Is my teaching interfering with academy operations?" "Quite the opposite. Academy-wide test scores are up, disciplinary incidents are down, and cadet morale is at the highest levels we've seen in years." Rodriguez sat down across from her desk. "The problem is that other instructors want to know how you're doing it. I'm just telling them stories. You're doing more than that. You're changing how these kids think about themselves." Rodriguez leaned forward. "I've got cadets who are planning to transfer out now talking about staying for advanced degrees. I've got discipline cases who are suddenly model students. What's your secret?" Sarah considered the question. "I stopped trying to teach them to be soldiers and started helping them understand what it means to be human." "That sounds like philosophy." Not military education. Maybe they're the same thing. Sarah pulled up her current lesson plan. Tomorrow I'm covering the evacuation of New Geneva. 80,000 civilians extracted from a planet under siege by
people who had no training in large-scale
operations. That's not in the standard curriculum. The standard curriculum teaches tactics and strategy. It doesn't teach the thing that makes human tactics work. Our willingness to attempt impossible things because someone needs us to try. Rodriguez studied her for a moment. You think traditional military education is inadequate? I think it's incomplete. We teach cadets how to follow orders and execute plans. But in real combat, plans fail. Orders become irrelevant. What matters then is the ability to adapt, to improvise, to find solutions that shouldn't exist. She gestured toward the window, where they could see cadets moving across the academy grounds in perfect formation. Every other species in the galaxy can train perfect soldiers. They can create units that execute flawless maneuvers and follow precise protocols. But when those protocols fail, their soldiers freeze. Human soldiers improvise. And you think that's teachable? I think it's already there. Every human child spends years learning to adapt to constantly changing rules and circumstances. They just need to be reminded that those skills apply to more than playground politics. Rodriguez left looking thoughtful, and Sarah returned to her preparation. Tomorrow's lesson would be different. She'd received a message that morning that had changed everything. The next day, Sarah faced her largest crowd yet. Students were sitting in the aisles, standing along the walls, and gathered in the hallway outside. But she didn't begin with a hologram or a historical recording. I received some news yesterday, she announced. The Vorthak have requested formal peace negotiations. The room erupted in whispers and excited chatter. The war is ending, Sarah continued, and I want to talk about why. She brought up a display showing military statistics from the 3-year conflict. Human forces had won decisive victories despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and facing superior technology. Standard military analysis suggests this outcome was impossible. Human victory defied every predictable model of interstellar warfare. She paused. So why did we win? Kim Santos raised her hand. Because we're unpredictable? Partly. But there's something deeper. Sarah activated a new display showing psychological profiles of various species. Every race we've encountered has a concept of acceptable losses. A point where the cost of victory becomes greater than the value of the objective. Morrison nodded. That makes sense. Why fight a war you can't afford to win? Exactly. And that's where human psychology becomes unique. Sarah highlighted the human psychological profile. Humans are the only known species that regularly chooses to pay costs that exceed the objective value of their goals. Webb, who had become one of her most engaged students since their conversation about his father, looked puzzled. That sounds stupid. It does, doesn't it? What kind of rational being spends more to achieve a goal than the goal is worth? Sarah smiled. But that's exactly what humans do constantly. We call it principle. She brought up examples. Parents working multiple jobs to pay for their children's education, soldiers dying to save strangers, scientists spending decades on research that might never succeed. The Vorthak couldn't understand this. Their analysis suggested that after the first year of casualties, humans would negotiate for peace. After the second year, we would surrender rather than continue losing ships and lives. Sarah's voice grew serious. They didn't understand that we weren't fighting for territory or resources. We were fighting for the right to exist. A new student Sarah didn't recognize raised her hand. But how is that a military advantage? Because it meant we would try things that made no strategic sense. We would sacrifice valuable assets for worthless objectives. We would continue fighting battles that were already lost. Sarah paused. And occasionally, that irrational persistence would turn impossible defeats into unexpected victories. She showed them the Battle of Kepler Station again, but this time from the Vorthak perspective, human forces making decisions that violated every principle of military logic. By the end of year 2, Vorthak commanders were requesting reassignment rather than face human forces. Not because we were superior warriors, but because fighting humans was like trying to solve a puzzle where the rules changed every time you thought you understood them. David Park was taking notes furiously. So we won because we're crazy, we won because we're human. Because when faced with extinction, we don't calculate optimal responses. We try everything we can think of, then try things we can't think of. then try things that shouldn't work. Sarah looked around the packed classroom. The Vorthak are requesting peace negotiations because they've concluded that humans are too unpredictable to defeat at an acceptable cost. The room was silent except for the sound of styluses on tablets. Which brings me to why I'm telling you all this. Sarah continued. The war is ending, but your education is just beginning. You're going to graduate into a galaxy where humans are known as the species that does impossible things. Other races will expect you to live up to that reputation. She deactivated the displays and sat on the edge of her desk. I can't teach you to be heroes. I can't give you the courage to face impossible odds or the wisdom to make perfect decisions under pressure. But I can remind you of something you already know. You're human. That's not a limitation to overcome. It's an advantage to embrace. Webb raised his hand. General, what if we're not good enough? What if we can't live up to what everyone expects? Sarah looked at the young man who'd lost his father to the war, whose anger had hidden his fear of inadequacy. Then you'll do what humans always do when they're not good enough, she said simply. You'll try anyway. You'll fail, you'll learn, you'll adapt, and you'll try again. And eventually you'll succeed at something that should have been impossible. The bell rang, but as usual, no one moved immediately. One more thing, Sarah added. I want you all to remember that being human isn't about being perfect. It's about being persistent. The heroes we study weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who refused to give up when giving up was the rational choice. As students finally began filing out, Sarah noticed they moved differently now. Less like cadets following routine, more like young adults carrying purpose. Maybe that was what teaching really meant, not filling empty minds with information, but helping young humans discover what they were already capable of becoming. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning when the Academy's emergency sirens began wailing. Sarah was reviewing graduation speeches when Principal Rodriguez burst into her classroom. General, we have a situation. A transport ship with civilian evacuees from the outer colonies has suffered catastrophic engine failure. They're on a collision course with the Academy. Sarah's military training kicked in immediately. Time to impact? 47 minutes. The ship is carrying 300 refugees, mostly families. Their life support is failing and they can't alter course. Rodriguez looked haggard. Our orbital defense platforms can destroy the ship before impact. But that means killing 300 civilians to save the Academy. Sarah stood, her mind already working through possibilities. What about evacuation? We can get most personnel to safety, but the Academy holds 10,000 people. There's not enough time for full evacuation? Rodriguez shook his head. The military council is meeting now to decide whether to sacrifice the transport to save the Academy. Sarah stared out the window at cadets moving across the grounds, unaware that their world was about to end in the next hour. Her students were among them. Kim, Morrison, Webb, David, all the young people she'd been teaching about human persistence and impossible solutions. Assemble my students, she said suddenly. General, all of them. Everyone who's been attending my classes. Get them to the main auditorium immediately. Sarah was already moving toward the door, and patch me into the Academy's communication system. Sarah, this isn't a teaching moment. This is a real crisis. Oh, exactly. She turned back to Rodriguez. You said it yourself. Humans do impossible things. Maybe it's time to let them try. 20 minutes later, Sarah stood before nearly 400 cadets packed into the Academy's main auditorium. On the screens around the room, she displayed the tactical situation. A massive transport ship tumbling toward them, its trajectory unavoidable by conventional means. The military council is deciding whether to destroy that ship to save the Academy, she announced without preamble. 300 civilians will die to preserve 10,000 military personnel and cadets. The auditorium was completely silent. By every rational calculation, that's the correct decision. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Standard military doctrine supports sacrificing the transport. Sarah paused. But we're human. We don't accept that everyone dies is sometimes the only answer. Kim Santos raised her hand. But General, what else can we do? We can't move the ship, can't we? Sarah brought up detailed schematics of the Academy systems. This facility has the most advanced training equipment in human space. We have tactical simulators, engineering workshops, prototype weapon systems, and the brightest young minds in the military. Morrison was studying the displays intently. You want us to find a solution the experts missed? I want you to do what humans do. Look at an impossible problem and ask what if. Sarah highlighted various academy systems. We have 37 minutes. The transport ship masses approximately 50,000 tons and is traveling at 15 kilometers per second. How do we stop it or redirect it without destroying it? For a moment, no one spoke. Then Webb raised his hand. What if we don't stop it? What if we catch it? Elaborate, Cadet Webb. The Academy has 12 orbital tugs for moving equipment and supplies. If we could coordinate them perfectly? He trailed off, doing calculations in his head. David Park picked up the thread. The tugs don't have enough power individually, but what if we use them like a net? Distributed force instead of concentrated impact? The timing would have to be perfect, Kim added, getting excited. And we'd need to account for the ship's rotation. Sarah watched as her students began working together, building on each other's ideas with the fearless creativity she'd been trying to nurture for months. Engineering cadets calculated thrust vectors while tactical students worked out coordination protocols. Medical students considered the stress on the refugees' bodies during deceleration. It's impossible, Morrison finally said. The margin for error is too small. If even one tug is off by a fraction of a second, the whole operation fails. Then we make sure no one is off, Webb replied. We don't use computer guidance. We use human pilots. Human pilots can't react fast enough for the kind of precision this requires, another student objected. But they can adapt when things go wrong, Kim countered, and things always go wrong. Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the moment when an impossible plan started to seem merely improbable. She activated her communication link to the Academy's command center. Principal Rodriguez, patch me through to the military council. A few seconds later, the voice of Admiral Harrison filled the auditorium. General Chen, you should be evacuating with the other senior staff. Admiral, my students have developed an alternative to destroying the transport. Sarah, this isn't the time for academic exercises. Sir, with respect, this is exactly the time. You're about to kill 300 people because conventional tactics have failed. Maybe it's time to try unconventional ones. She outlined the students' plan. Using the Academy's orbital tugs in a coordinated capture maneuver, with human pilots making real-time adjustments to compensate for variables no computer could calculate. The silence on the communication link stretched for nearly a minute. The plan has a 12% chance of success, Admiral Harrison finally said. And if it fails, we lose both the transport and the Academy. If we do nothing, we definitely lose the transport, Sarah replied. And we lose something else, the belief that humans can find solutions when rational options are exhausted. Another pause. You're asking me to bet 10,000 lives on a plan developed by students in 20 minutes. I'm asking you to bet on what makes us human, sir. Our refusal to accept that some problems don't have solutions. General Chen, Admiral Harrison's voice was strained. Do you believe this plan will work? Sarah looked out at her students, young faces filled with determination and fear and hope. Kids who'd learned to question assumptions and think beyond conventional parameters. The next generation of humans who would face impossible challenges in an uncertain galaxy. I believe it's worth trying, sir. And I believe these students are exactly the right people to try it. The decision came down to the last possible moment. With 18 minutes to impact, Admiral Harrison gave authorization for the attempt. The next 17 minutes passed in a blur of coordinated chaos. Sarah watched from the command center as her students took control of systems they'd only studied in simulators. Webb coordinated the tug pilots with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Kim calculated trajectory adjustments faster than the Academy's computers. Morrison managed communications between 12 separate spacecraft with the calm authority of a veteran officer. With 30 seconds to impact, the transport ship was caught in a web of tractor beams and thrust vectors. Its deadly momentum gradually converted into controlled descent toward the Academy's emergency landing field. It worked. 300 civilians walked off the transport ship alive. The Academy sustained minor damage to its landing facilities but remained fully operational. And Sarah's students had proven that being human meant more than just adapting to impossible circumstances. Sometimes, it meant creating possibilities where none had existed before. As the emergency teams finished processing the refugees, Sarah found herself surrounded by her students in the academy's main courtyard. They looked different now, less like cadets following curriculum, more like the leaders they were becoming. "General," Kim said quietly, "was this what you were trying to teach us all along?" Sarah smiled. "I was trying to teach you that being human is its own kind of superpower. Today you taught yourselves." Webb, the student who'd begun the semester angry and disruptive, stepped forward. "My dad would have been proud of what we did today." "Your dad would have been proud of who you've become," Sarah replied. "All of you." As the students dispersed to their various duties and responsibilities, Sarah remained in the courtyard, watching them go. Tomorrow she would return to teaching about historical battles and tactical theory. But today, her students had written their own chapter in the ongoing story of human persistence. And she couldn't wait to tell the next class about it. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood before a very different classroom. The formal rows of desks had been replaced with flexible seating arrangements that could be reconfigured for group discussions or hands-on exercises. The walls displayed not just historical battles, but student projects, tactical innovations, engineering solutions, and philosophical essays about what it meant to be human in an interconnected galaxy. Her students were different too. Kim Santos had been accepted into the Advanced Strategic Studies program and was already developing new theories about multi-species coalition tactics. Morrison had transferred to engineering and was working on improvements to the orbital tug systems that had saved the transport ship. Webb had surprised everyone by requesting assignment to the diplomatic corps, saying he wanted to help other species understand human psychology. "Today is our last class before graduation," Sarah announced to the mixed group of cadets, senior students, and even some instructors who'd started attending her sessions. "I want to talk about what comes next." She activated a holographic display showing star charts of known space, human worlds, alien territories, unexplored regions that promised both opportunities and dangers. "The war with the Vorthak is officially over. Peace treaties have been signed." "But that doesn't mean the challenges are finished." Sarah gestured to the vast expanses of unknown space. "If anything, peace is more complicated than war. In war, the objectives are clear. In peace, you have to figure out what you're building toward." A newer student raised her hand. "General, what do you think humanity's role will be in the galaxy now?" "I think we'll do what we always do, whatever needs to be done," Sarah smiled. "Other species see us as the unpredictable factor, the ones who do impossible things. But I think our real gift to the galaxy isn't our tactics or our persistence. It's our ability to see potential where others see problems." She brought up images from recent diplomatic missions, humans working alongside former enemies, joint research projects between species that had never cooperated before, cultural exchange programs that were creating entirely new forms of art and philosophy. "The Vorthak have some of the most advanced mathematical minds in known space, but they couldn't figure out how to fight us effectively. Do you know why?" Sarah looked around the room. "Because they were trying to solve us like an equation. But humans aren't equations. We're improvisations," Webb raised his hand. "So what happens when we're not fighting anymore? What happens to that improvisational ability? It becomes the foundation for everything we build together." Sarah brought up a new image. The proposed Galactic Institute for Collaborative Research, a joint venture between humans and 6 other species. "The same creativity that makes us effective in combat makes us valuable as partners. We don't just adapt to existing systems, we imagine better ones." She walked among her students, noting how they sat together regardless of their specializations or backgrounds. Engineers discussing philosophy with historians, tactical students debating ethics with medical cadets. "I've learned something important over the past year," Sarah continued. "I thought teaching was about passing on knowledge from someone who knew to someone who didn't, but that's not what teaching is at all." Kim Santos smiled. "What is it then?" "Teaching is about helping people discover what they're already capable of becoming." Sarah gestured to the diverse group filling her classroom. "Every one of you came here thinking you needed to learn how to be a soldier, an engineer, a diplomat, a leader. But you already were those things. You just needed to be reminded." Morrison looked thoughtful. "So what you're saying is we taught ourselves?" "You taught each other. I just provided the stories." Sarah returned to the front of the room. "And that's what I want you to remember as you leave here and start your careers. The greatest human innovations don't come from individual genius. They come from people working together, building on each other's ideas, creating solutions that no one could have imagined alone. She activated one final display, a compilation of messages from across human space. Former students serving on exploration vessels, developing new technologies, negotiating trade agreements, teaching at schools on distant worlds. "This is your legacy," Sarah said. "Not just what you'll accomplish, but what you'll inspire others to accomplish. Every problem you solve, every boundary you cross, every impossible thing you make possible, will encourage someone else to try something equally impossible." David Park raised his hand. "General, what about you? What's next for your teaching?" Sarah had been expecting this question. "I've been offered a position at the Galactic Institute, developing curriculum for interspecies cooperation. It seems that other races want to understand how humans approach problems." The room erupted in excited chatter. Sarah raised her hand for quiet. "But more importantly, I've realized that my best teaching happens when I'm learning alongside my students. So I'll be taking classes too. Vorthak mathematical theory, Altarian organizational psychology, Zentoran ecological systems. It turns out that being human means being curious about everything, even things that initially seem alien." A student from the back of the room called out, "Will you still tell stories?" Sarah laughed. "I'll always tell stories, but now I'll be collecting new ones. Stories about humans and aliens working together. Stories about problems we solved because we combined human creativity with non-human expertise. Stories about what becomes possible when different ways of thinking meet in the same space." The graduation ceremony bells began ringing across the academy. "That's our cue," Sarah said. "In a few hours, you'll be walking across that stage as graduates. Tomorrow, you'll be scattered across the galaxy, facing challenges we can't even imagine yet." She paused, looking at each face in turn. "But you won't be facing them alone. You'll be facing them as humans with all the adaptability and persistence and creativity that implies. And more importantly, you'll be facing them together." As students began gathering their belongings, Webb approached her desk. "General, I wanted to thank you, not just for the lessons, but for helping me understand that my father's death wasn't meaningless." "Your father's death was a tragedy, Marcus, but your response to it has been anything but meaningless." Sarah clasped his shoulder. "He would be proud of the leader you've become." After the last student left, Sarah stood alone in her transformed classroom. Through the windows, she could see graduates and families gathering for the ceremony. In a few months, these young people would be serving throughout human space and beyond, carrying with them the lessons they'd learned not just from her, but from each other. She thought about her own journey, from the general who'd led soldiers into impossible battles to the teacher who'd struggled to manage a simple classroom. Both roles had taught her the same fundamental truth. Leadership wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about helping others discover their own capacity for extraordinary things. Sarah's tablet chimed with a message from Admiral Harrison. "Congratulations on another outstanding class, General. The Academy has never produced graduates better prepared for the challenges ahead. Thank you for reminding us all what it means to be human." As she prepared to leave her classroom for the last time, Sarah realized that her greatest victory hadn't been any battle she'd won during the war. It had been here, in this room, watching young humans discover that their humanity wasn't a limitation to overcome, but a strength to embrace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new stories to tell. But today she was content to have been part of helping the next generation understand that being human meant being endlessly, impossibly magnificently adaptable, and in a universe full of unknowns, that was exactly what they would need to be.